Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yep, works. Okay. I'll give another. Good morning. Oh, here comes Eve. She made it. Actually, just plain curiosity. Like I hate magic black boxes. Want to know how things work. Maybe some things you shouldn't know how they work, like making sausage. Maybe you don't want to know, but for most things, I'm curious. I'll give it another minute. Yes, that magic phrase, recording in progress. Well, it is about 10 o'clock, so this is the second in a series of Everyday Magic. And this is going to be all the stuff that we have outside the house that we take completely for granted. We look at it, we see it every day, and we don't even think about it. It's just there. But if you've looked at what's outside there, things like streets, roads, sidewalks, street lighting, so it's safe, traffic lights, which we take for granted. They weren't always the way they are today. And then things like storm sewers. Where does all the water go when it rains? And it doesn't go where you think it goes. It doesn't go into the sewage system. It's an entirely different system. And then the electricity that we take for granted, it comes to our house, but how does it get there? And so if any of you have ever driven on a dirt road or a gravel road, you know that you don't go very fast and it can be a bone jarring experience. So we have outside roads that are smooth. You go on I-75, you can go 80, 90 miles an hour, and it's more or less safe. And so the roads are really higher tech than you think. It's taken a while to get there. And so these are the things we take for granted. They're convenient, they're very efficient, and moreover, they're safety. And so you don't have to read all this, but we're going to talk about roads and streets, and we're going to talk about asphalt and concrete, which are two different things. The concrete is the light colored stuff, the asphalt is dark. And they're used for two different things. If you notice, your driveway and your sidewalks are concrete, but your road is asphalt, or more specifically, asphalt with some other stuff with a lot of little stones in it. And this is stuff they call aggregate, which is simply another name for small stones, usually between a ½ inch, 3/4 inch in size, that's mixed in with the asphalt, and it gives it greater strength. And so the reason we have these two different things is because even though the concrete is more durable, it's more expensive, and it takes a little bit more to put it down, requires more of a base. And you notice that they're blocks of concrete, it's separated. You can't have a continuous strip of concrete or it would crack. So you notice when you look at your sidewalk, there's certain blocks and then there's a space, and then there's another block and a space. And so what concrete is basically cement, sand, aggregate, and water. And this has a chemical reaction, which works even underwater. And when it hardens, it's pretty durable and it's waterproof. And it's, if nothing really cracks it, it lasts quite a long time. Asphalt, by comparison, is the stuff that comes out of the oil well. The stuff that comes out of the oil well is bitumen, and you get asphalt from that. But what you do is you mix it with the gravel, and you mix it with sand, you mix it with these little stones, and it makes a very good road surface. It's relatively cheap, it's durable, and it's easy to apply. And what's more, it's a little bit more flexible, but it has tremendous strength and wearability, and it requires relatively little maintenance, but it isn't quite as durable as cement. And so it costs more to put down. Well, it costs less to put down, but it has a shorter lifespan. So if we look at what asphalt is, it's very high viscosity stuff. It's impervious to water. It's reasonably elastic and flexible. It's good adhesion to little stones that give it strength. And it resists weather very well. It also has a fairly rough surface, so it's relatively skid resistant. And it's reasonably durable. It has some drawbacks, and that is it doesn't last quite as long as concrete. And if it gets very hot, sometimes it gets sticky. So it requires a little bit more maintenance. Now, those of you who've owned houses, you probably have had to replace a driveway at one time. And when I talked to my paving contractor, he said, well, you can use concrete, it'll cost you more. Or you can use asphalt, but you have to seal it once a year. So I said, well, wait a minute. The state of Maryland puts down roads every day, and I've yet to see them seal a road. So what are they using? Oh, well, they're using state of Maryland road compound. I said, what's that? Well, it's all this aggregate, these little gravel things, mixed in with this asphalt, mixed in with this bitumen. And so they heat the stuff up, the stones adhere very well, and they dump a load of this on the driveway. And then somebody with a rake smooths it out, and then a guy with a steamroller compacts it down to about 2 inches. And he said it has certain advantages. It's cheap, it's durable, and it's relatively maintenance-free. I said, yeah, that's what I want. So you put down a driveway, it'll probably last 20 or more years because there's not much traffic. If you look at the road outside here at Okamic, the sidewalks are concrete, but the road, if you look at it carefully, you'll see the little stones in it. And you'll see that it doesn't require sealing. It's pretty durable, and it's relatively rough so that you get good traction on it when you drive on it. So that's the miracle of asphalt and our pavement. And then we go to things like landscaping, which we take for granted. And there are practical reasons for it. The trees give us shade and oxygen, but then we want ground cover. We want something that'll hold the land and keep it from going. And so grass is one of the few ground covers that you can walk on. There are very few other plants you can put on there which allows you to walk, but grass is it. A lot of the contractors use some stuff called crown vetch, which is great for slopes. From a distance, it looks pretty good. Up close, it looks pretty grungy. And then if you've been to the seashore, you have the seagrass, which preserves the dunes. And it doesn't look very good. It's kind of roughy looking stuff, but it has a long root and it preserves the barrier islands, keeps them from eroding. So now we've learned that we have to plant these plants to keep everything from moving. And then there are aesthetic reasons. Gardens are pleasant to look at. If you look at the buildings around here, they all have so-called foundation plants, which kind of make the buildings look a little better. And then during the war, we had the so-called victory gardens, where we took up some of the grass and grew vegetables. Then we have parks, land set aside for recreation, preservation of wildlife. And in 1872, Yellowstone was the first national park. And since then, we've gotten a lot more. And then you have botanical gardens, which are devoted to preserving plants. And if we were in Baltimore, we were near Longwood Gardens. And at Christmas time, you had all the poinsettias and all the other plants. Interestingly enough, they had a room there of medicinal plants, and where they showed you where most of your drugs came from. Well, now we're going to talk about street lights. You know, when the sun goes down, it gets dark, but we have street lights now which are fairly bright, which are safe, allow us to walk without having to carry a lantern to see where we're going. And We didn't always have street lights. We started out using oil lamps way back when, and then they progressed to gas lights. And I can remember when I was a child, the street I lived on had gas lights. And a man would come at dark to turn the light on. Then he'd come back in the morning to turn it off. And it was a nice light, but it didn't give a whole lot of light. So you had them spaced, but in between it was fairly dark. So then we went to incandescent bulbs, which gave us a lot more light. And then we went to the halogen vapor lights, which are the intense bluish lights. And then we went to the sodium vapor, which was more efficient, but these are the yellowish lights that you see on the roads. And then finally, we're going to LED lights, which LEDs can now be made very, very bright. They're low cost, they're cool, and more importantly, they use much less power than any of the other lights we have there. So the history of street lighting is interesting. It goes back to 1750 in Philadelphia, where Ben Franklin introduced the whale oil street lights. Then in 1773, Boston and John Hancock installed 300 oil lamps. 1809, New York City put in 1,800 oil lamps. And then finally, gas lighting came in, which was much an improvement. It gave a lot more light. And then in 1807, London's Pall Mall was lit. My hometown of Baltimore in 1817 had gas lamps. And that was about 10 times brighter than oil, but even so, it wasn't terribly bright. Cleveland, Ohio had electric arc lamps, and they were fairly short-lived. If you've ever had to deal with an electric arc lamp, you know that what you do is you strike two carbon rods, and then you separate them. It gives a very bright light, but you need a clockwork to keep it going because the graphite rods get consumed as the light burns. So in 1911, we got tungsten filaments, and that was the major improvement in incandescent lights. So in 1919, San Francisco replaced their oil and arc lights. 1950, we had the mercury vapor. 1960, we had the sodium vapor. And now in 2007, they're all going to be changed. Ann Arbor led the way with LED lights. But in time, all of your street lights will become LED lights because they're cheaper, they're more efficient, they use less electricity, and we now have them where they're very bright and they can give every bit as much light or even more than the lights we have now. And a major factor is, what does it cost to light these bulbs? Well, in 1980, they figured it cost $280 a year to run the incandescent light. The mercury vapor costs a little less than half of that. The low pressure sodium vapor was about half of that. And then the high pressure sodium vapor was about 30–40% less. The LED, we don't have costs available, but it's estimated it will cost half of what the sodium vapor light costs to run. So that's another reason to switch all out to LEDs. Next thing you take for granted, traffic lights. They weren't always there, and they weren't always the way we see them. And you're always taught that the stoplight is red, the caution light is amber, is yellow, and the go light is green, but they're not. The next time you're out, take a good close look at them, and you'll see the red is sort of an orange red. The yellow light is amber, and the green light is sort of a bluish green. They're purposely designed that way, so the 8% of red-green blind colorblind men can distinguish the colors. And the reason they're that way is because the original traffic lights were red, yellow, and green. And those of you who remember them, the red light had a horizontal bar, the green light had a vertical bar, the yellow light had a diagonal bar. So you could tell which was which. And they weren't always the way you see, with the red light at the top and the green light at the bottom. Sometimes the green light was at the top. And if you have horizontally placed lights, they can be any which way. So you needed the bar to tell where the lights were. Interestingly enough, the traffic lights were figured out around 1928 by a fellow named Charles Adler. And he realized that the lights would be hard to see if there was a glare from the sun. So they figured out a plastic lens for it that would help ameliorate that, and also the little hood around them to shade the light from the sun so the sun doesn't glare out the light. But now we're talking about having a fourth light in your traffic lights. And this is a white light in preparation for the self-driving cars. And that's a signal to the car that it's safe to keep driving. So if in the future you see there's a fourth traffic light and it's white, you'll know what that's about. Well, now we're going to switch and we're going to talk about storm sewers. And we get a lot of rain here in Florida, and we're used to the water being drained away by that thing on the street called a storm sewer. But where does the water go? It doesn't go into the sewage system. This is a whole separate drainage system, and you'd probably be surprised where it does go. Now, Florida's interesting. A stormwater system is a tool for managing the runoff from rainfall. But before Florida was developed, the state was an area with many wetlands. And wetlands are an important ecological system because they provide a habitat for unique and important organisms, help control flooding by slowing down storm surges, and absorbing rainwater before it reaches the water bodies. And they help filter out nutrients and sediments collected by the rainwater, and it settles it out before it enters the waterways. In other words, basically most of Florida is a swamp. So where does the stormwater go when you've got a land that already has a lot of water in it? Well, we have 4 types of storm sewer systems here. And the first one is what they call a retention basin. It's just a lower level of land. It's designed to store the runoff for about 72 hours, at which time the water will seep through the soil and return to the aquifer, return to the groundwater. So it can be man-made, can be natural, and they may have some grass in it. It stabilizes, but basically it filters out the water. So it's a closed system, and the water doesn't reach the natural bodies like streams or rivers. It goes back into the aquifer. Now, if you think about it, rainwater is clean water, so there's no reason why it shouldn't be recycled into the aquifer. And the next system is the stormwater swale. And you notice it has a discharge tube right at the very end there. So it's man-made or natural. It allows the water to be absorbed into the ground. And it also has a runoff to allow the water to flow into some waterways. So it's basically a shallow ditch. If the water isn't too severe, if the rain isn't too severe, the water that fills it will be absorbed into the ground, and anything that's extra will flow into the bodies. Well, then we have 2 more types of storm drainage systems. We have a dry retention system, which holds a certain amount of water, and the idea is that the water will percolate in 72 hours. But if it can't, there's a runoff that allows the water to overflow and will go into the bigger drainage system. And then finally, we have what they call a wet retention, which is basically a pond. And it's designed to hold the water. It's got a runoff, so if the amount of rainfall is too great, it will run off. But this is designed to remain wet. And so you'll see these ponds, and as long as the water level is below the discharge tube, it will remain there. Now, I've always wondered about these because these make wonderful mosquito breeding places. And so I guess it's a trade-off. So we have 2 systems. We have sewers and we have storm drains. The storm drains are designed to carry off rain runoff and other drainage, but it's not designed to carry nasty stuff or hazardous waste. And so the runoff is carried in underground pipes. Now the sewer system goes into two sewer treatment plants. Whoops. Okay, well, there's a missing slide that I thought I had, but what it showed was the drainage system. And what it is, the sewers from the rainwater just go into the ground. They don't go anywhere. So you may have some pipes coming out from them, but they're eventually designed to be absorbed into the aquifer in the ground, whereas your sewer system is a series of closed pipes that go to either the Main Street treatment plant or the Kanapaha plant. So the last thing we're going to talk about is electricity, because we get it and we just assume it's going to be there. And the problem was you generate electricity, but then you have to transmit it to your house. And if the wires are fairly long or the distances are long, you lose a lot of it along the way. And so around the mid-1880s was when the breakthrough came, when we developed transformers that would allow us to boost the voltage of the electricity to a much higher level. There was a competition in the United States between direct current and alternating current, between Edison and Westinghouse. And there were two things involved. One was Edison thought that direct current was the way to go. George Westinghouse thought that alternating current was better, but Edison said, well, alternating current is dangerous, and particularly if it's around 220 volts. So he said, well, if you're going to use AC, you got to use a lower voltage. It's a lot safer. Westinghouse won out with the alternating current because you can't send direct current very far without losing a lot of it along the way, and you have to have stations that boost the current up. So here's our transmission system. You have in red a transmitting station, a transformer that boosts the voltage from the approximate 11,000 volts that the generator produces to about 130 or 140,000 volts. And the reason they do this is because you lose relatively little in transmission that way. And so the line is high up in the air, and then it goes to a substation where you have a transformer that lowers the voltage. And then you have several other substations from that which lower the voltage still more. So what you have is transmission at a very high voltage, and then a substation that kicks down the 138,000 volts to about 70,000 volts. Then another substation that goes to about 13 to 4,000 volts, and finally it comes to us at 120 to 220 volts. So how do we get our power? Well, the transmission, the generator puts out 11,000 volts. We have the high voltage. The substation kicks it down to about 70,000 volts, and then it gets reduced further. So if you're a commercial business, you'll get 220 to 440 volts. Your home is 120 to 240 volts. The subway and the streetcar uses about 650 volts. Interestingly enough, the Long Island Railroad upped their voltage to 750 because they had newer cars and they had a problem with the voltage along the line. The electric train that you see that uses the overhead wire is running at 25,000 volts. So there's considerable change in how we do. Now this is what we're used to seeing, the light pole. So what is all this stuff on the light pole? Well, the very highest wire is the highest voltage. And then we have things progressively lower voltage along the wire. So if we take a closer look at what's at top, the very topmost wire is the high voltage wire. If we go to the bar below that, on the right we have a little thing called a cutout, and that's in case something happens, you can turn off the juice. So you have a way of stopping and controlling what's happening Below that, you have this box, which is a transformer to lower the voltage, and next to it is a lightning arrestor, because these poles do attract lightning. And so you've got to have a way to take that bolt of lightning to the ground safely. And so from that lightning arrestor, there'll be a wire going straight into the ground. Then you have the wire coming from the transformer to your house. Now, you have wires lower on the pole, and the lower you go on the pole, the lower the voltage. So you have your lower voltage wires below the transformer. The wires below that are your fiber optics, your telephone lines, and various other things that share the pole. So finally, we have what's coming to your house. Well, you notice there are 3 wires coming from the transformer to your house. And each of the outer wires is a hot wire. The middle one is a neutral wire. So from 7,200 volts, the transformer, 240 volts is coming to the house. Now, the things you're going to plug into the wall take 120 volts, but your electric stove and oven, your air conditioner, your electric dryer all take 240 volts. They require more power. If you're one of these people that has a Tesla with a rapid charger, that requires 240 volts. So we have 240 volts available to our house, and most of the time, most of the stuff we use will plug into the 120 volt. Now, as you know, if you've done any traveling, the world's electricity is not uniform. In North America, in red, we have 120 volts at 60 hertz. Other parts of the world will have 220. Most of Europe is 220 at either 50 or 60 hertz. And you'll find out the hard way that the device you have doesn't work there. You'll blow it out. So if you travel, you need a transformer that will convert 110 volts to 220 or vice versa. Now, there's some devices I've seen which have a switch in them, which allow you to use either one, but the plugs are different. And so you need to have a whole series of plugs to plug into the different outlets. The difference between 50 and 60 hertz is not a problem, although you might notice that under 50 hertz, the lights tend to flicker a little bit. In Baltimore, BG&E has a thing called misutility. They know what's buried underground, and they're very happy if you don't disturb the stuff they have there. Because I was at the Path Institute when somebody using a bulldozer ran into an 8-inch gas main and ruptured it. Fortunately, it didn't catch fire, but it was a while when they evacuated the building and then turned off the gas. In the Baltimore Beltway, which are a lot of, bridges and stuff, before the days of fiber optics, telephone cables were rather thick. And somebody cut through 2 telephone cables, which were about a foot in diameter. And it took BG&E technicians about 3 days to reconnect 28,000 wires. So they're happy if you don't interfere with this stuff. But what's buried underground is a lot. There's a whole city there. Electric cables, telephone lines, gas mains, water mains, fiber optics cables, sewage pipes, and then you have subway light rail systems. And in Baltimore, we also had steam lines downtown. So outside the house, we take for granted all these things. We have streets that are comfortable to drive on, that are smooth, that usually are not full of potholes. We have sidewalks that are nice and smooth to walk on. We have all these wires and pipes that deliver our utilities, our water, our drainage, street lights so we can see where we're going, traffic lights to control traffic. And then we take for granted the street signs, the street names, directional signs. There's a lot of stuff out there. We take it all for granted. It makes our life a lot more convenient, a lot more pleasant, a lot more comfortable. And it's all this magic that we have outside the house. So If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Anything that you want to know? No. Eve? You always have a question. Yes, I can hear you. Oh, a microphone's coming.
So I have some questions about the servicing of these items. So when there's all this stuff up on a pole, a lineman climbs up and turns things off and on or repairs them. When it's underground, how do people repair that? Can this be done remotely now?
No, just the way they repaired our water main outside our house. They come and they dig up, they bust into the street, they dig it up, they have to expose the pipes and service it that way. So yes. Now the reason they put it underground is it's safer. You know, usually unless somebody maliciously disturbs it, it's going to be pretty safe underground. Now, what happens in Baltimore, where the water pipes are now 100 years old, they're beginning to leak. And what they have to do is dig up the street and replace the pipes. If you have an old sewage system with terracotta pipes, after about 50 years, they crumble. And so you got to dig down like we did when we replaced our septic system. Somebody comes in with a backhoe, tears the heck out of our front lawn, and replaces these terracotta pipes with PVC pipe. So yeah, it's a mess. Now, as far as your light pole, people with spikes on their boots climb the pole and repair it. So when our telephone wire, which was copper, after 50 or 60 years, the joints get corroded or the copper gets corroded and the telephone service isn't very good. Somebody climbed the pole and replaced the connector. Yes. And so you have people there repairing the streets. You have people, you know, doing all the stuff. The good news is that the streets and a lot of this requires relatively little maintenance. And so if you lay down a new road, you expect it to be good for the next 15, 20 years with minimal maintenance required, maybe just repair a crack or two. And the same thing with the street lamps. With LED lights, you won't have to replace incandescent bulbs as often. So you don't have people on a truck with one of these little things with a hydraulic lift that lifts you up to where the light is. With an LED traffic light, you replace that light maybe once every 5 years. So yeah, the maintenance has to be done. And sometimes it gets messy. If you've ever seen them put a new road in, it's kind of messy. You have this hot tar mix with rocks where the dump trucks just dump it and then the big machine compresses it down. And it's hot, miserable work. And if you've ever seen a cement truck at work, it basically making a big mud pie, which you then smooth off. And then what they do is they have a thing called a bull float, which you rub across the top, and that lets the stones, the aggregate, drop down so you get a smooth surface. And then if you look at the surface outside in the atrium, you notice that that cement surface is roughened. And it's purposely done that way because when the cement was poured, somebody went over it with a broom to roughen up the surface a little bit. Now, when you pour commercial concrete, it takes about an hour to set up, which means that you go from a mixed slurry to something you can walk on. But it's still loose enough that if you broom off the top, you get a nice roughened surface.
An interesting fact about 50 cycle or 50 hertz electricity used by countries such as Russia
Yes.
on their submarines, the electricity will create a resonant cycle. And we had detectors on the submarine that you could listen and you knew immediately whether it was one of ours or one of theirs.
Interesting. So they've marked it out for you.
Okay.
Manholes everywhere.
Good. I'm sorry. Right, sooner or later, you do have to repair this stuff. And so you have conduits, you have manholes where you have the electric, you have the water. And no, you usually don't. I mean, unless you have a big city like New York City or Baltimore, where you have a lot of stuff underground. Gainesville's a relatively young city. You know, you talk about cities like Boston and Baltimore that go back to colonial times. Gainesville is very new, so we have more modern stuff.
Any other questions? No?
Well, thank you all.
Wanna ask one?
We have one.
I guess I have to, since I'm part of the Friends of Nature Parks, and one of the things that I'm always fond of talking about, and I think you know this, Joe, is Sweetwater Wetlands Preserve, which
Yes.
started out as a way to clear the water, but has become, and it was really a byproduct of setting the water purification area in a natural setting, is to also turn it into a park that people could enjoy. Well, I happened to be over at Gainesville Health and Fitness, and I asked why they were ripping up the parking lot. And they said, well, we're ripping up the parking lot because we're going to have a basin where the parking lot is right now, and the basin will remove all the storm water from Gainesville Health and Fitness, and we'll fill it with sand, and it'll have pipes coming up that will collect the water, and it'll drain down through the sand, and then we'll put the parking lot back over it. And that's exactly what they did. And it took them about a month to do it. But I asked them, I said, well, so you're really doing what Sweetwater Wetlands already does? And they said, yes, this is exactly what Sweetwater Wetlands does, except it's costing a lot more to construct it.
Right. Well, if you think about it, the rainwater goes into the soil here. When you pave over a lot of the soil, you've eliminated a lot of surface where water can be absorbed. And so I'm sorry I didn't put in the map of the drain water system, but you'll see a lot of red lines that go nowhere. In other words, you have a sewer, you have a little bit of a pipe, and then it goes into the ground. And the whole idea is to have it drain back into the aquifer so that now the places like Sweetwater and Plains Prairie, they receive the discharge from the Kanapaha treatment plant. And the discharge from that plant is drinkable water. It's state of the art. And so it goes back into the aquifer eventually.
Another point, I lived in Citrus County for 30 years, and for a few years I sat on the Planning and Development Board where we reviewed requests for exceptions from normal ordinances and so forth. And one of the things that we had to require from all waterfront property was that they install suitable swales and berms to hold the first half inch of water before it would drain the fertilizer and the sewage plant discharge into the waterways. And people always wanted an exception so they could look out their window and see the water right there. And I don't know if anyone ever checked to make sure that our requirements were met. I doubt it.
Right. Well, back home we had a basement and you have a window that's below ground level. So you have a pit there with and if you don't have a swale next to your house, that area fills with water and you get water in your basement. So a swale is more than just aesthetic. It's there to perform a function. It's taking the water away from the house. It's also taking it away from the street, and it's putting it into a place where it can be absorbed. But aesthetics aside, you don't want to look and see water next to your house.
Of course. Anybody else? Oh, okay.
An interesting thing about the debate, AC and DC, I don't know if Edison invented the electric chair, but I know he was a proponent of it. And he liked that as a demonstration to prove that AC was inherently dangerous. And also, a few years ago, I read a book, I think it's called Empires of Light. I may have the uh, name wrong, but it's a very good historical book about Edison, Tesla, and Westinghouse and the AC and DC debate.
Right, it's a fascinating story. 220 volts is more efficient than 120 volts, and the Europeans use that. The people here were swayed by Edison's argument that 220 was more dangerous than 120. It is, but I don't think it's that much more. But that's why you have all the different voltages. It was a battle between Edison, Tesla, and George Westinghouse. AC won out simply because it was more efficient to transmit. And it was obvious even to Edison that DC was not going to be the way to go. Now, that said, there are a lot of things that run off of DC current. All your LEDs run off of DC. A lot of your trains have DC motors. So direct current is still there. But most of which we have here is alternating current. And most of the appliances we use, motors, run off of alternating current. And so far, it's fairly safe. I've replaced some fixtures where I've been so-called bit by 110 volts AC. It's not pleasant, but fortunately, it's not lethal either.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. That was wonderful, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Right. They have 220, don't they? About 220, 240. Actually, you know, the 120 and the 140, it's root mean squared. So it's really, when you look at the curve, that's not the peak of the curve.